Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all joining us for the fourth webinar that KIX EAP is organizing. EAP stands for Europe, Asia, Pacific. It's a monthly webinar series, and it is a series that is part of KIX. KIX is funded by the Global Partnership for Education and administered by IDRC. IDRC is International Development Research Center in Ottawa. KIX is an abbreviation. It stands for Knowledge and Information Exchange, and the whole concept of KIX and of GPE is that there is a vast amount of expertise in countries, in GPE countries, and it's a matter of surfacing them and engaging national experts with other national experts in neighboring countries, in the region, but also globally. So the expectation is that there is much more national expertise involvement also at the global level, rather than from the global down to the national. And we are very happy that we are, as NORRAG, administering the hub for this region, which includes Europe, Asia, Pacific. There are 21 GPE countries. A large pocket of countries in the region speaks Russian. Central Asia, some in Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus. And a few countries also speak Arabic. So we're very happy to be like a trilingual hub, and we try our best to accommodate the wishes of the participants. In April, we did a survey in the countries and asked, what are the topics you're working on? What are the topics you're interested in? What should be emphasized more at the regional level and global level? And one of the topics that emerged very clearly was the use of data, but not for reporting purposes, because many of you in your countries, you use data all the time, you collect data, sometimes a lot, but more for reporting purposes or monitoring, and not really for own purposes of improving learning, teaching, curriculum issues, issues that go all the way down to the classroom and school level. So we are extremely pleased that, one of the foremost, I think, in my opinion, the expert on that topic, ACER, agreed to moderate and present in that fourth webinar that we are having. ACER is not just an expert in the whole region, and I would say even globally, on topics related to data and learning. ACER stands for Australian Council for Educational Research, and they're very kind, our colleagues. It's 7 o'clock in Australia, and it's very kind that they join us at this time. But ACER is also one of our strategic partners in the hub. Together with ACER, it's also FHI 360, Nazarbayev University, UNESCO, Bangkok, but also we work closely with UNESCO Paris, IIP, and UNICEF. So it's in this dual role as experts in this field, but also as strategic partners for KIX that we are welcoming very much ACER. Let me pass the floor to the manager of our hub for this region, Europe, Asia, Pacific, José Luis Canellas. José Luis.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Kitesana Ramsey, for your welcoming words and for setting the context for today's webinar. I want to briefly outline our webinar today. It's structured across 4 aspects of learning, which are defining learning, measuring learning, understanding learning, and improving learning. So Dr. Elizabeth Cassidy, ACER's Senior Research Fellow, will be setting the scene by providing perspectives on purposes and use of data. Then Janine Spink, ACER Research Director of the Education and Development Program, will help us in defining and measuring learning, looking at SDG reporting and indicators for reporting progress on student achievements. A first Q&A will follow before Dr. Tim Friedman, ACER Senior Research Fellow, will help us in understanding learning and understanding the context and the factors behind learning. After that, Professor Pauline Taylor-Gay, the Director of ACER Institute and Center for School and Student and System Improvement, will guide us into improving learning between thought and practice in school and system improvements. With this, we will have a second Q&A before our closing session. I will now, with no further delay, I will now hand over to Dr. Elizabeth Cassidy to start our voyage to the translation of data into learning. Dr. Elizabeth, please, over to you.
Hello, and can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Gita and Jose Luis, for the introduction and for all of your support in helping organize this presentation. So good morning, everyone, and good evening from the east coast of Australia. I am Elizabeth Cassidy, and as Jose Luis said, I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research. Sorry. Excuse me. When we do a presentation in Australia, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And so I will acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the people, and pay our respect to elders past, present, and future. So we're hoping to share with you in this webinar today some of our experiences with using data to improve learning and also engaging in policy and reform. I'm going to set the scene for the presentation. Firstly, I'll tell you just a little bit about ACER and our work in research and education globally. And secondly, to propose some broad ideas about how we can use data. My colleagues Janine Spink, Tim Friedman, and Pauline Taylor-Guy will then explore these ideas with examples from research and practice in a range of contexts and programs. So it seems fitting to start. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development sets the scene for our presentation nicely. Quality, accessible, timely, and reliable data will be needed to help with measurement and progress to ensure that no one is left behind. Such data is key to decision making. So I think we're all familiar with the global learning crisis. The general statistics on this slide are confronting. 258 million children, adolescents, and youth are out of school. 617 million children and adolescents are not achieving minimum proficiency levels in reading and maths. And 1 in 3 primary school students in East and Southeast Asia, for example, doesn't meet minimum proficiency levels in reading and maths. So in acknowledging this, ACER has been focusing our work to both understand and address this learning crisis. As the Australian Council for Educational Research, we're an independent, not-for-profit international research organisation, and we've provided support and expertise to education policymakers and professional practitioners since we were established in 1930. We work globally with a range of educational practitioners, schools, education departments, ministries of education, tertiary institutions, donor organizations, and non-government organizations. And we also have more than 400 staff in offices across Australia, Indonesia, India, the UAE, and the UK. So I mentioned we were established in 1930, and ACER's approach is drawn from those 90 years of experience of working in educational research internationally and in Australia. And this experience has helped our organization develop a global approach that focuses on local impact. So throughout this presentation, we'll discuss examples of system-to-school policy development and reform that is based on evidence. So, the big question, how can we use data? Assessment and monitoring are important and need to be available and interpretable to understand what students know and can do. I was in a meeting yesterday with one of our donor partners in this region, And he suggested the government that we work with needed to be more engaged in the effort to collect evidence. He also mentioned the need for us as research and donor organizations to support the government in developing skills in using data. So public policies, he said, are made with spending and effort to collect evidence. This is important. So he highlighted both a challenge and a benefit of data, the need to encourage the government's use of data and the benefit for policymaking. As we all know, there are a number of challenges in using data. We have found often that there's limited data available on learning outcomes for many low and middle income countries. And this presents challenges for addressing the questions and issues that I have addressed on this slide and what we'll be talking about throughout this presentation. Some of the issues we've also found are assessment data may only be available for the particular needs at particular year levels, and that learning, as we all know, is highly varied across countries and contexts. However, addressing these data challenges can have an impact for schools and teachers. I've also included some points about that above on this slide. Data enables teachers to address particular learning needs. Supporting teachers to understand and use data includes some of these following points. Data can provide more than just standardized test scores. Data can provide exploration of questions about teaching practices and learning that may arise in the classroom. And data enables teachers and educational practitioners to talk to each other about what works or what doesn't work. So I'm going to turn my time over to my colleagues, and they will be discussing these 4 key aspects of learning, specifically defining and measuring learning. How do we define and measure learning? The UN Sustainable Development Goals provide a framework for these tasks. Janine Spink will discuss how minimum proficiency levels provide a common understanding of student progression. She further explores some examples of how we can measure learning. How can we understand where students are at in their learning? And importantly, how to understand disparity to inform more equitable outcomes for all. Understanding learning. Context matters. For example, data collected through the Pacific Islands Literacy and Numeracy Assessment, or PILNA, an assessment that I'm very involved with, gives us an indication of country contexts via student, teacher, and principal questionnaires, and how background can inform learning outcomes and policy decisions. My colleague Tim Friedman will discuss a range of examples to outline just how important learning about context is to understanding learning. And finally, improving learning. So, how do we work to improve academic and well-being outcomes for all students? Pauline Taylor-Guy explains how to apply good practice and tools in school settings. She explores what good measurable practices look like, as well as the importance of collecting and analyzing evidence. These are critical aspects of building a shared language to understand improvement. And with that, I'm going to turn this part of the presentation over to my colleague, Janine Spink.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody for joining and for participating in what we are also very thrilled to be part of, as well as our ACER colleagues. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on 2 things. I'm going to focus, as Elizabeth said, on defining learning and on measuring learning. I'm going to look at summarising some of the global work that has been happening around the development of a common set of definitions for reading and mathematics against the SDGs, and then how we can meaningfully measure learning in these 2 domains. Next. In the World Development Report from 2018, sorry, before Elizabeth, 2018, Learning to Realise Education's Promise, the World Bank put learning firmly at the centre of the global education agenda. As part of the report's introduction, this statement was made. To take learning seriously, start by measuring it. Very simple statement. But in order to measure something, anything, first we have to define what it is that we intend to measure. And as part of that, create a common set of metrics by which we can then measure it. Now, for reading and for mathematics, this was a challenging exercise, particularly when we're talking on a global level. In an effort to address this challenge, the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning, which was established, led by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics and supported by specialist organisations from across the world. A priority of GAML was to develop a set of definitions against the indicators for SDG 4.1.1. Domain experts from around the world have now proposed common definitions of minimum proficiency levels in reading and in mathematics for the 3 points of measurement, SDG 4.1.1. So we have end of lower primary, end of primary, and end of lower secondary. And I'm sure there's probably many people on this call that were part of that process of development of these definitions. But as part of that as well was ACER. And so we've been working closely with the UIS and with GAML through our accredited partnership with UNESCO to support the development of these common definitions. Next. Elizabeth, yeah. So what you can see here, or perhaps what you can't see because the text is quite small and I apologize, are the minimum proficiency levels or the proposed minimum proficiency levels for the 2 domains at the 3 measurement points. So these definitions, as I mentioned, they're still in the process of broad consultation, but we are now getting close to having a common set of definitions, which means we can now meaningfully measure learning in these related domains. Next. The SDGs define learning against 3 separate points in a child's schooling. But it is important to recognise that learning is a progression and that a child's progression in learning can be measured and reported against at any point in time. What we're interested in is not that all children reach the same target at the same time, but rather the underlying growth in student achievement. So in order to meaningfully measure learning, to understand learning and to improve learning, which is what we're talking about here today, an empirical and a narrative representation of the growth in student learning is critical. So on this slide, we're using an example of reading. First, I'll have a look at the empirical. By using a method of item response theory, we can scale student results, which provides us with a common empirical point of reference for the growth in student learning, in this case for reading. We call this the scale, the scale of measurement. So scale scores are helpful for comparative reasons across contexts and over time, but they only tell us part of the story. What we also want to know is what students can do, so that we can then meaningfully support them to improve their learning. So that brings me to the second dimension of measuring learning, the narrative. A set of descriptions of what students can do across all levels of their learning growth. This 2-dimensional measure of student learning is what ACER calls a described proficiency scale. Any assessment that uses this multi-dimensional approach to measure learning can in turn report progress against the global SDG indicators. Next. So what you can see here is an example of a described proficiency scale, and this one has specifically been developed for the Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics Program. It is, of course, a summary of the described proficiency scale. We can't fit it all onto one page. But the CPLM is led by CMEO and by UNICEF and includes membership of ministries of education across 6 participating countries: Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Vietnam. And I was delighted to see that many of the ministry representatives are here with us again today. This is a regional level assessment of grade 5 students in reading, writing, and in mathematics. By developing a clear set of descriptors of what students can do, which is underpinned by robust empirical evidence of actual student responses, we can do a number of important things when it comes to measurement and in turn reporting of student results. The first, rather than just reporting population mean, we can report the proportion of students who are at each level of the proficiency in the scale. So this helps us to understand the spread of student results and, importantly, any equity issues across populations. And we know that no population is uniform. What we want to know is what students can do within that population, what different students can do within that population. Secondly, by using a described proficiency scale that has both a numerical and a narrative dimension to measurement, we can align these results to the SDG indicators for 4.1.1. In the case of CPLM, we can therefore report on the proportion of students who meet the SDG minimum proficiency levels for the end of primary. And we can do that for all of the 6 countries that participate in the CPLM assessment. Thirdly, we can accurately measure change in student performance over time. So we mentioned this before, the important aspect of what we're looking at here is not so much that every student reaches a certain point, but that we're seeing growth in student learning. And that's the big factor around this. We want to see growth in student learning. So how do we measure and monitor growth? And fourthly, we can then set policy targets against these described proficiency scales, or common benchmarks, which may be at the national or at the regional level. The SDGs are global benchmarks, but this is not to say that regions, countries, or even subpopulations within countries can't set their own benchmarks. The important aspect of this is that whilst we might see different benchmarks, they are all reported against the same descriptions or the same described proficiency scales, so we can accurately assess differences across contexts and over time. Next. So just to sum up, measuring learning. A common definition of learning, which is what the global community has spent a lot of time and effort in developing, a common set of definition of learning, which is then underpinned by a common learning progression, means that we can set common benchmarks for learning across different contexts. We can define policy targets for learning across contexts and over time. We can understand learning progress of systems as well as individual students. Next. So the described proficiency scales provide a conceptual and an empirical dimension of reporting student learning. It allows us to know where students are and support them to move to their next stage of learning. It helps to recognize the disparity of learning outcomes, which is such an important point in the context. So the described proficiency scales help us to both understand and improve learning. And on that note, I think I will hand back over for questions. Jose, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. So all the participants, if you want to ask any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we can also let you unmute you to ask them orally if you prefer. And maybe to start picking up some ideas, so I'd like to ask the countries that are here represented whether they had any challenges with these common definitions of learning, whether they find it challenging to adapt it to their own context, what have been the experience so far. So we've got here a question from Hayani Chakra, which asks, is this the foundation of performance referencing? Janine, if you'd like to pick this one.
So if we're talking about performance referencing, let's suggest for a moment that our point of reference are these definitions for the Sustainable Development Goals in reading and mathematics. Now, is this a foundation around reading and mathematics? This is what we're aiming for on a global basis, yes. That doesn't mean that everyone has to use the same definition for their own performance targets, but what it does is give a common reference point for definitions of performance or minimum proficiency levels for reading and for mathematics at those 3 points. That's not to say that students' performance is entirely guided by reading and mathematics. There are many other elements of learning. We're only looking at 2 very small elements of a child's learning development. But what we're looking at is a common reference point around those 2 domains. So in some ways, yes. In other ways, there's a bigger question at hand here. I don't know if I've answered the gentleman's question, Rain's question, sorry, but.
No, that sounds clear, Jenny. So now we've received a question from Aminat Shaif Adan from Maldives, and she's saying, I realize a lot what has been presented is related to quantitative data that we collect about students' progression. I would like to ask what sort of qualitative that we could also use then to inform teaching, and how could we do it in a systematic way? I also realized that the qualitative data is often overlooked.
What an excellent question. So the described proficiency scale has both an empirical and a narrative element to it. So yes, there is an empirical basis of the development of the described proficiency scale. And yes, it is heavily empirical and heavily quantitative analysis and process. But the development of the proficiency descriptors is very much a qualitative aspect. So we're looking at, and this is just looking at a reference point. This is not then collecting information on what students can do. So what we can see here is we can describe a progression of learning of what students can do using empirical data, but also expert judgments of those that are involved in those domain areas. Now, what you're saying here is I'd like to ask what sort of qualitative that we could also use to inform teaching. Now, you will hear a lot about this element of the discussion from my colleague, Pauline Taylor-Guy. And so I don't want to comment on that too much, but there is certainly a huge area of discussion around that. And I hope that Pauline will help cover some of that content in her presentation later on.
Perfect, thanks, Janine. I would like to ask Terence Gillis from Tajikistan, Tajikistan, if he would like to pose his question orally.
Thank you, everyone. Very interesting and useful presentation. And, you know, the context here is that with our project, we have conducted early grade reading assessments here at grade 2 and grade 4 over recent years. And so in a sense, two things to ask. Firstly, you know, when you present the results, and as the presentation suggested, you know, every student that's below the standard is seen as a failure in the eyes of the ministry, and that obviously the ministry feels, you know, uncomfortable that maybe there is a high percentage of students below the bench, but below the standard. So, you know, I'm very interested in these, you know, how you define the different levels of progress according to those described proficiency scales, and therefore, you know, in order to assist the ministry to understand, you know, what is a realistic benchmark and how to progressively improve things, rather than just have a kind of fairly arbitrary standard that kind of is hard to attain. You know, what is the process to go about, you know, identifying those benchmarks? Thank you.
Another excellent question. So the development and defining of benchmarks. Personally, I'm not a great fan of benchmarks. What I like to see, though, is any benchmarks that reference growth, not targets. So when we're looking at these described proficiency scales, what we have tended to see in the past is what proportion of students pass and fail, what proportion of students meet a particular point in the scale, or what percentage of students don't. Now, we don't want to be talking about what students can't do. We want to be talking about what students can do. And we want to know what proportion of the population can do different things. Now, on the basis of that, we can then start talking about meaningful intervention strategies. We don't want to be bringing all students to a particular point all at the same time, because all students are different. It completely is counterintuitive to the context of learning. What we want to be understanding is where students are at, how many of those students are at that level, and where do they want to go, or how can we get them to the next level. Now, we will be looking, when we're talking with ministries of education, and ministries of education are talking to ministries of finance, we also need to be looking at targets, and we need to be demonstrating performance, and we need to be demonstrating achievement and growth in this area. Now, if we can start thinking a little bit more creatively around how we set those targets and how we set benchmarks of performance and target policies, that in itself is a really powerful message to be sending through, to say what we want to know is what children can do. And then we want to support those children to get to the next stage. We're interested in growth, not targets. So the whole conversation around benchmarks is fraught with politics. It always is. Hugely political discussion. It's not necessarily a technical discussion. It rarely is a technical discussion, in fact. But if we keep the conversation around growth in learning, then perhaps we can navigate some of those complex conversations.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Janine. So right now, I would like to just ask Musa Adam to pose his question orally as well, because his point is related to also the comment from Gita Steiner-Kamsi, Professor Gita Steiner-Kamsi. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, the presentation is very interesting. I wanted to ask, for example, in the context of Maldives, and I think also quite a lot of other countries are moving towards this continuous assessment or formative assessment of learning. So, when we talk about, providing data, especially with regard to SDGs and everything, I was thinking how we could streamline, or what we could do in terms of, the national assessment system to streamline to the international standards and frameworks, such as, like what we saw in the presentation, how we could, because if we are to kind of do or get different kind of data in, if we to report these kinds of for other internationals, what could be done in order to streamline? I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a question that we receive often from many of the partners that we work with, and it is a real challenge. I mean, the SDGs were approved in 2015, and whilst that probably seems like quite a long time ago, to move systems to be able to adjust to these new global indicators is really a huge process. It's a very, very difficult and a very complex process. So a very small part of that shifting of the process is looking at how we monitor learning. In fact, it's a huge area, of course, but it's how do we monitor learning, and how do we support systems to monitor learning? Now, what we're saying is that the underpinning progression of learning in reading and mathematics is common. That all students, regardless of context, regardless of language, that there is a common progression of learning in reading and in mathematics. Now, at what stage those students develop at within that progression is entirely up to the student. Their context, their background, their learning ability, it varies widely by student. But that progression is common. Now, what that means is that there's a whole conversation around how do we monitor students' progression in learning? And how do we look at that from an empirical perspective and a narratives perspective? So we can look at a judgment of where a child is at, but we can also understand while what a child at that point, what they can do. So talking about a reform in a national student assessment program, there's no doubt that is a big undertaking. I can't lie to you. It's a huge undertaking. But what we want to be looking at is at the national, the subnational, the school, and right down to the student level. Because there will be different reasons that we want to report on this. We might want to report on this for financial reasons. We might want to report on this for individual student intervention reasons. But because we have a common point of reference around the definitions and around the proficiency scales, we can then monitor growth accurately and meaningfully. And we can adjust the systems accordingly to be able to monitor that common progression of growth of students.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Janine, shall we get a last question from the chat? We received the question from Sang Hong from Cambodia, who says one of the common questions we had here as well. So his concern is about the fact that we only look at reading, writing, and math, but something lacking is in the measure of attitudes and behaviors. So if you could please briefly clarify on that.
So I'm looking specifically at what the Sustainable Development Goals have looking at targets and indicators, and they have focused in on reading and mathematics. So under the CPLM assessment, it included reading, mathematics, and writing. In fact, it was the first time that writing was ever assessed across multiple scripts. But the question around attitudes and behaviors, this is something that my colleague, Dr. Freeman, will also be able to possibly be able to respond to, because in that we're actually understanding learning. And often the kinds of information that we're looking at comes from the contextual questionnaires, comes from the teacher questionnaires, from the student questionnaires. What's their attitude to learning? What kind of, and this can be both a quantitative or a qualitative data collection exercise. But we know there are many, many factors that influence learning, and that whole question around understanding learning is really important. So there's no question that attitude and behaviors are absolutely critical, but it's more around understanding learning, and that's often collected in large-scale data sets from the contextual questionnaires.
Okay, perfect, Janine. I think that makes a good link to the next presentation that we'll have. We'll further clarify these points, right? Shall we move on to Tim?
So hello, I'm Tim Friedman, and I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak to so many people from around the world, different time slots, be translated into multiple languages. That's a real new concept for me. So just really grateful to be here. So Janine's talked about measuring learning. I'm going to talk about, once we've able to measure learning, how do we actually understand the learning that's taken place? And the way I'm going to do that is talking about different contextual factors that might provide insight into the learning. And in the large-scale surveys that we're often involved with at ACER, we often have contextual instruments that act as a complementary role in those surveys. And the contextual data can help us try to paint a picture why a student is performing at a particular level. When a student has a high level of achievement, is it because they're going to an expensive school, in a good neighborhood, with family members that are able to provide all the extra support that they need? Is it that they have great teachers who have a passion for the job, who deliver the curriculum in innovative and engaging ways? Is it that the school principals put all the systems in place to ensure that every child is able to achieve their very best in schooling? Or is it just none of those factors? Is it the fact that the child is just naturally bright, has a passion for learning, is hardworking, despite having limited support around them from the home at school? And this is where contextual instruments really work well to help solve the pieces of the puzzle to understand why some students are learning at different levels to others. And once we understand why they're learning at different levels, we can actually try to do something about it. So contextual data collections help us understand the contexts in which learning takes place. They can explain variation in achievement, and the ultimate goal is to help inform evidence-based policymaking in education. And I'm just going to quickly highlight that in the 3 boxes below, some of the different surveys that ACER is involved with. Just relating to one of the questions we had prior to me speaking, ACER is the international contractor for the OECD study of social emotional skills, where we are looking at different emotional and behavioural resources that children have. So that is something that's sort of a deviation from the traditional study where we look at academic outcomes. But we do a variety of contextual work for studies for the IEA, OECD. We have involvement in regional surveys, CPLM, as Janine talked about before, and PILNA, as Elizabeth mentioned, and quite a wide variety of national surveys. And I've listed just 3 examples there that are quite relevant to this group. So we'll go on to the next slide now, and I'm just going to talk about some of the different types of contextual factors that we have. And I'm going to draw from an example from the CPLM contextual framework. The framework acts as the blueprint for all the contextual content, and it links the policy needs with the data collection to establish exactly what we need to collect, and more importantly, why we need to collect it. And I'll just go quickly through some of the theory behind this. We have antecedent variables, and these are fixed things that impact the learning process. So things like the structure of an education system or the gender of a child. These are things that, that influence the learning processes. The process variables, and these are things that directly influence learning outcomes. They're often constrained by the antecedent variables, things like the curriculum, what teachers and students actually do in the classroom, how much parents are helping students at home. And in CPLM and in other international surveys, there's a hierarchy that we set up to establish contextual factors at different levels. And the 4 different levels that we've included here are variables at the wider community level, the school and classroom level, at the student level, and the home environment level. And when we go to the next slide, I'll just show you how the antecedent variables and the process variables interact. We have the fixed antecedent variables, such as the educational system, impacting the process variables, things like student learning processes. And these student learning processes, in turn, influence the outcomes variables. And the example we have here is also from CPLM, where we have mathematics, literacy, and also global citizenship student outcomes. And you'll see there that there is a double arrow between the learning processes and outcomes. So the outcomes themselves can also feed back into the learning processes. Students' knowledge will impact some of these processes on what they understand and do in the classroom. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to go through some of the different contextual variables that we know make a difference to student learning. So at the wider community level, and these are divided up into two subcategories. We have the education system. So for example, the structure of the education system, policies related to education, curriculum related to the learning area in question, teacher training in the learning area, and student assessment in the learning area. We know all these things do influence student learning. We also have factors at the local community level, such as the neighbourhood resources, neighbourhood demographic and social makeup. Urbanisation, we know that often students from more urban areas outperform students from regional areas where the resources might not be the same. We know students attending schools where the communities have a great involvement. It really makes a difference. And of course, the availability of childcare settings, particularly prior to the children entering school, makes a difference. The next slide talks about the school and, my apologies, the next slide, I want to show you an example from ICCS 2016. So this is the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. What we have here is an example from our systems questionnaire that we call the National Context Survey, where we asked each of the participating countries to provide information about their curriculum, about the education system. And given that the outcome variable in that study is about children's civic and citizenship education knowledge, we wanted to find information about how teachers were trained in that area. Were they trained in their pre-service education? Were they given in-service training? And which types of teachers were given this type of training? And as you can see, there's quite big differences across some of the countries that are included in this part of the table. And when we find differences across countries, why students from some countries are outperforming students from other countries, this is something that we can go back to and try to work out why. What is it about these particular countries where these students are doing better than other countries? And hopefully this can impact policy reforms for those countries that have lower levels of knowledge in this area. The next slide is about influences at the school and the classroom level. So we know that characteristics of school leaders makes a difference. Get a good principal into the school, they'll lead change that will have better outcomes. Resourcing, we know that some schools, particularly those that with more funding, they're more likely to have better staff-student ratios, more facilities, better technology. The students are more likely to do better. The policies that the leadership are able to introduce, the school size, the amount of professional development that they provide their teachers, these are things that we know from different studies all have an impact. At the classroom level, we know that classes where teachers have more resources available, the activities that the teachers do inside the class, how they teach their reading, how they teach, what sort of activities the children do, the climate, is it a collaborative atmosphere? Is it more with a lecture style? The experience of a teacher, their training, the confidence of a teacher, these things all are known to make a difference to learning. And if we go to the next slide, we have another example from a study. This is the MTEG, the monitoring trends in educational growth for Afghanistan. And what we can see here, that students that attended schools where the school had a policy of monitoring teacher attendance, these students had outperformed students from other schools where they didn't have such a policy, and they outperformed them by 1 standard deviation, which is a very large difference. So school policies such as this can make a very big difference on learning outcomes. And if we go to the next slide, we look at influences on learning at the student and home level. Demographic information, we know that gender, age, these have a difference. Girls tend to outperform boys in literacy assessment. Age has a bit of an interesting relationship that changes depending on the subject matter, what the target rate is. We know students that attend early childhood education tend to do better. Students that have more positive attitude towards schooling, who are more confident and have higher educational aspirations that want to go further on in their education, they do better. And we know that the context of the home level really makes a difference. Parents, more well-resourced households where the parents have occupations of a higher prestige, the higher education levels, they have higher household resources, where the home learning environment is strong, where parents really get involved in the child's schoolwork, where the family structure, where depending on the makeup of the family, the number of siblings, and whether or not the student comes from a immigration or ethnic background, these things all make a difference. And the next slide, I'll just show you an example of something at the student level that makes a big difference. And our colleagues at ECAP put together this great infographic from the regional report from the 2018 study. And it shows that students who attended early childhood education really outperformed quite significantly students that didn't attend early childhood education for both literacy on the right and numeracy on the left. And I'll now just talk about equity in the next slide now. So the SDG Goal 4 mentions equity to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So universally, we know that socioeconomic status of families is a very big predictor for student achievement. And we find that across almost all studies. And they're really important that we get these socioeconomic measures for these studies, that we establish them quite well. We need to measure equity. We need to see which students are those being disadvantaged, perhaps identifying those who are at risk of being left behind. So it's a very important input or construct variable to predict outcomes, but we also want to know, be able to account for SES for other reasons. Because it's so strong, the relationship between socioeconomic background and achievement can often mask other things that may not have an effect if it's not taken into account. And what I mean by that is sometimes we see things and there's clear differences between students or between schools where we know it's the socioeconomic background that's making the difference. We know it's that the families happen to be wealthier or the school happens to be better funded. So in order so we can account for that, we need to have good socioeconomic status measures so we can then identify real differences. And when we account for these differences in socioeconomic status, when we see something that makes a difference, it's a real difference. So those students who are coming from poor households, who are attending poor schools, who have higher levels of learning, what is it about these students? Is it the fact that they've got great teachers that are going the extra mile? Or is it that they've got a strong culture in their family to encourage schoolwork? I'll just go to the next slide now and just show some data we have from some secondary analysis data we did from the PEARL's Progress in Reading Literacy study. You can see at the bottom, for the lower and middle income countries, the socioeconomic status indicators account for roughly 1/4 in the variance in achievement. This is before taking into account anything about the students themselves, about their attitudes, before taking into account anything about the teachers, simply based on the characteristics of their household and the school that we're already accounting for 1/4 of achievement, which is quite remarkable. And just close this presentation, was part of the presentation, but just talking about some of the different data sources we have. There's a need for more secondary research. These studies produce a huge amount of data that's just sitting there waiting to be analysed, and hopefully we can link this data back to policy. There is data sets from some of the bigger studies available from the various websites. They generally require a certain understanding of quantitative research. We have some tools, for instance, the NCS tool based in America, which has interactive options where you can actually mine through some of the data and produce some of the same tables that you would see in the international or national reports. And at ACER, we've also worked recently on developing a data explorer tool that was used in the recent Pilner cycle, where we had policymakers with no quantitative experience filtering through menus in their data and producing tables and graphs and statements on significance that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So we really just want to make sure that this data is used, because when it affects policy change, it makes things better for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Now I'll pass the floor to Pauline.
Just checking that you can hear me. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Perfect, thank you. And again, I'd like to add my voice to my colleagues. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak to a global audience. And it's also a lovely opportunity for me to work with my colleagues. We're kind of scattered around Australia currently. So I'm very much grateful for this opportunity and looking forward to discussing any questions you may have. So my area of work at ACER is I lead our work globally in school and system improvement. And I've been picking up on some of the questions and some of the elements from the presentation from my colleagues that's gone prior to be able to really pick up on those touch points that participants have raised. So I suppose it might sound like stating the obvious, but the ultimate goal of school improvement is to improve academic outcomes for all students, academic and wellbeing outcomes for all students. And what does this mean then? It means a focus on the day-to-day practices that happen in schools. Tim referred to before that we know that good teachers make a difference. We know that good school leaders make a difference. We know that strong policy makes a difference. But essentially, if we want those things to matter, we have to focus on the day-to-day practices. And we also need to have a shared understanding of what good practice looks like and those specific observable and measurable practices that generate improvement. And it also means using research-based frameworks to collect evidence of current practice, to pinpoint current levels of performance in different domains of practice. So, and as with all evidence or data or assessment, we really need to know what's going on currently so that we can plan for that improvement or growth. So we go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about ACER's tools, because these frame our global work in school and system improvement. We've developed a suite of improvement tools or frameworks which explicate those observable, measurable practices. But it's not on those observable, measurable practices about everything that a school has to do, or a principal has to do, or an education system has to do, but simply those practices that have most impact on improving learning. We develop these tools from systematically reviewing empirical studies in the field, whether it's the field about school improvement or school leadership or education system improvement. We look at that empirical research to saturation to identify those practices that impact on learning. And as Tim was saying, for example, we do know what makes a difference in learning: the teachers, the principal, the system, and our schools focus on those observable, measurable practices. Systems and school leaders can use these frameworks for self-review, and many do, or they engage with us to provide an external lens using the tools as a point of reference. The best known of ACER's tools is the National School Improvement Tool, and we have now almost a decade of evidence to demonstrate its effectiveness in vastly different contexts. So I'm going to give you a rapid overview or tour of the tool and that evidence of impact. But first of all, I want to tell you a little bit of a story about its development. So the first tool that was developed, the National School Improvement Tool, was developed in collaboration with the Queensland Education Department as a result of a review conducted by Professor Jeff Masters, our CEO at ACER, and provoked by the state's extremely poor performance in the national testing program. It was adopted as Australia's national school improvement tool in 2012 and has been used not only in Australia but across the world. And we now have a whole range of evidence to be able to show its impact. So next slide, please, Elizabeth. The tool was developed, as I said, in collaboration with Queensland Education Department because of the poor performance of students in Queensland, particularly primary school students in areas of literacy and numeracy. And the tools came from a original framework, and then they were developed up to be able to make very specific the kinds of areas of practice that would make a difference in school improvement. So the National School Improvement Tools, as I've said, are all designed in the same way. They're developed from empirical research, and that research is thematically and systematically and thematically reviewed to identify domains or themes from that literature. There are 9 domains in the National School Improvement Tool. There actually is 6 in the Principal Performance Improvement Tool and 6 in the Education System Improvement Tool. This slide shows domain 2. And it's significant because I don't think any of us who work in this field would say that we don't have data. We have lots of data. But what we tend not to have is that really deep analysis and discussion of data right in the day-to-day practices in schools. So each domain in the National School Improvement Tool or any of our tools has a descriptor at the top, which is an overarching statement of the characteristics or observable, measurable practices in that particular area. And every tool has a specific domain around data. Note, though, that this domain is not about collecting data, but how we analyze it and discuss that data at a school level using data in the day-to-day practices in schools. So the next slide, please, Elizabeth. Thank you. Another characteristic of our tools is the performance levels. We have developed performance levels against each domain of each tool in 4 areas: outstanding, high, medium, and low. And the performance levels of each domain reflect the levels of embeddedness of those particular practices in the school. If we're saying, and we're reviewing from evidence about outstanding practice, we would say that it relates to everyone, all the time, over time in the school. That's world's best practice. Everyone, all the time, over time. And we collect evidence from what we read in a school, what we see and hear in a school from multiple perspectives or stakeholders. So this is more qualitative component of what we were talking about using data. While this is qualitative data, it is of course collected within a common frame of reference and relates to those specific observable, measurable practices or characteristics, which were indicated in the previous slide, those dot points that we can see there. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. So our tools are designed to build a shared language, a shared focus, a shared commitment, and importantly, a shared understanding of what improvement looks like. About those practices that focus, they're observable and measurable practices. And we are looking at improvement or growth in each of those domains. Our tools recognize that every school is on the same journey, but at a different place on the road. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Thank you. We know from that decade of evidence, is that the right slide, Elizabeth? Have we gone 2 ahead or maybe I'll swap that around? Okay, thank you. Thank you. We know what works. We know what works from the evidence that we've collected over that period of time. We know that what works is about building that shared language, commitment, and understanding about what improvement looks like. It's about knowing through the characteristics what good practice looks like. It's about collecting and analysing evidence, what we read, what we see, and what we hear in a school from multiple perspectives. It's about academic achievement and wellbeing data and teacher judgment to ascertain current performance. It's about narrow and a sharp improvement agenda with targets and goals that are monitored. It's about identifying a small number of ambitious goals, including building capacity in instructional leadership, teaching, monitoring and evaluation, and being able to deliver on them. And it's also about activating intrinsic motivation and collective capacity building. So our next slide. When we look at the evidence, even recent evidence, we can see that these principles are the things that drive improvement in day-to-day practice. So if we look at this quote from Cochrane and colleagues from just this year, engaging with principles around instruction and data more than ever is important. A higher percentage of high-performing schools and systems, a higher percentage of supervisors discussed effective practices in teaching and learning, conducted meetings directly related to the findings from data, and discussed feedback from classroom walkthroughs with principals. We know that this makes a difference. We know that we need to pay attention to demographic data. We know we need to pay attention to instructional processes data. And we know that we need to pay attention to achievement data, including student performance on state, district, and teacher developed tests. And we know that schools need exemplary support. So on to the next slide, please. What do we know about improving learning that really works and works rapidly? We know that understanding the bigger context and the school context is important. We know that using data to know where you are as a school at a school level is very important. We know that by analysing, discussing those data, prioritising a small number of desired student improvement outcomes makes a difference, as does setting measurable student outcome targets with timelines. Working out the best evidence-based strategies for your school with timelines, milestones, delegations, human resources and budgets, those are all areas and domains within the National School Improvement Tool is critical. And measuring and monitoring progress in the day-to-day practice, regular reviewing and reflective all make a difference. And now in the next slide, I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples. I'm going to tell you the story about Queensland because it's really provided a huge insight for us into how these practices work. I'm going to give you an example of how our tools can be used to evaluate performance in very varied contexts, including in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts and communities in Australia, how they've been used in early childhood in Papua New Guinea. And I won't be looking at particular examples in China or the United Arab Emirates or Indonesia just now, but they're all contexts and where our tools have been used very successfully. So if we go to the next slide, I've just got some prompts there around the different contexts. Remember I said that the National School Improvement Tool was developed because of extraordinarily poor performance by Queensland primary school students. In a period of 8 years and using the tool to have a consistent language and a shared language and understanding about improvement, the Grattan report in late 2018 showed beyond any doubt in its report about measuring our students' success that Queensland have moved from the poorest performing state relatively to the best performing state in all outcomes measures across all cohorts. And that couldn't be explained away by issues such as they had to introduce a prep year of schooling, for example, that was not explained by those data. So it went from the worst performing state to the best performing state in Australia. And in 2019, Queensland Education Department won an International Carnegie Award for Sustained School and System Improvement. We use these frameworks to think about how we can evaluate and improve all different kinds of settings or learning in all different kinds of settings. This graphic here is related to an Indigenous kindy program. Indigenous children in Australia are amongst the most disadvantaged in multiple ways, but the tool has been used, and our tools and approach have been used to really evaluate programs and identify areas for improvement. And the photograph on the right-hand side is in relation to an evaluation project in early childhood in Papua New Guinea, where the same framework can be used to identify strengths and areas for improvement in early childhood practice. So my point here really is to say that if you use a common frame of reference that is built from empirical research, it doesn't matter which context you're using in that, but because the focus is on impactful practices on learning, and that can be applied in any context. If we have a look at the next slide, thank you, Elizabeth, we can also see what doesn't work. And this is really where I want to end presentation and have some questions, is that no education system in the world has realized system reform through a dominant accountability agenda. It's about growth, it's about improvement, it's around having really good evidence and a narrow and sharp and achievable but ambitious goals for improvement. And we know what doesn't work is fat plans. And I'm using Michael Fullan's language there. We like the narrow and sharp and the skinny plan, because fat plans where we're trying to do everything all the time has never been shown to work internationally. So thank you for your attention in this presentation. I hope you have some questions. I know that you'll have some for my colleague Tim as well, but thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pauline. So we have been receiving very interesting questions and comments. And I may start by giving the floor to Aminat Shaifia Adam. She's been engaging in a very interesting conversation in the chat about how all of this applies to the classroom. So how can teachers make good use of this? So Aminat.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure the time at different countries, probably different time. We are here in the afternoon, all right? I'm from the Maldives. I'm actually really having some concerns regarding how our teachers really understand the meaning of data. I mean, it seems like from my experience and talking to teachers, and while also realizing what happens in the school context, that a lot of our teachers understand data as just statistics or quantitative pen. I was just thinking in your opinion, and how would you really think, and what would you really suggest in terms of how we can really approach to changing that thinking in the school context? I know that we will need to do a lot of research, but could you just share your experiences about how teachers in Australia or other countries where you have done research, and what you think about, how to go best way or best practices to really think about their changing of understanding and philosophy about data?
So the challenge that you raise is common in all countries, in our work across all countries, that teachers sometimes do not understand what data are not familiar with the way in which they can analyze and discuss. You notice that domain analysis and discussion of data, they're not aware of ways, they don't understand ways in which they can analyze and discuss data that is actually meaningful for them to be able to pinpoint starting points for learning for all of their students. That's a common challenge. And one of the things about the characteristics and the practices of the tool in that particular domain is that schools actually work with each other on building their understanding around data. They actually they work to build that. And in the best schools, the schools that have really understood that well, teachers are automatically using data all the time in their classroom. So we say it's not just about from standardized assessments, it's also about teachers observing students in the classroom, because they're the professionals making professional judgments, and also about quality classroom assessments. So when those things converge and teachers have the confidence and understanding to see growth and learning progression, then that really makes a huge difference. Now, that is not easy work. It's not easy work to do. It means to take a gaze away from data that is done to teachers actually feeling empowered to use it and to see how their students are progressing. And another core component of that is, of course, they need to know what learning progression looks like, referring back to Janine's presentation. Like, if you don't know what the learning progression looks like, how can you see that your students are improving? So using triangulated data sets and empowering teachers and their understanding to be able to use data, that is the key. And we know that even in our work in Australia, that's a common thing that we have. Our teachers are, I often say, drowning in a deluge of data. Our teachers would say that. That would be their experience, but using the data, analyzing the data, trying things out, what's working, how is it working? And that's a collaborative effort. It's not down to the individual teacher in the classroom. It's about their collective efficacy. What is working in this context and why is it working or not? So thank you for raising that. It's a common challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have received a related comment from Nick Tenazas from Philippines. He says, I think teachers would generally like to interpret and adapt to data, but how can we make it easier for them, especially in the context of large class sizes? They have very little time outside of the regular class hours due to other assignments and responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think that's really a challenge for teachers, the busyness of teachers, the crowdedness of curriculum. But if we can see ways in which teachers see this as automatically part of their practice. If you think about the way that teachers work, teachers will observe, they will use tools or assessments to see where students are in their learning. And then, you know, but those are continuous cycles that teachers would use. It's not analyzing data separately, even though standardized instruments are important, but teachers really understanding learning progression, what learning progression looks like in different discipline areas or different fields, and being able to use their skills, their professional knowledge to be able to pinpoint starting points for student learning. It really makes a huge difference. And it's not seen, I think the main challenge is that data is not seen as something separate from the business of the day-to-day practice in every classroom. It's actually part of the DNA of what teachers do in the classroom. And teachers need to have confidence built around that. And that's where, you know, collective efficacy, collaborative professional learning, inquiry-based approaches in the classroom about what's working and why is it working are really important, and evidence-based strategies for improvement.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Now I'd like to give the floor to one of our participants, Irina Favaeva, who will pose her questions in Russian. So I'd like to ask our Russian interpreters to please help us here.
Mm-hmm.
Irina, can you hear us?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my question is related to psychological and physiological part. When you assess, is it important psychological condition of children, the physiology of children? Of course, the influence of a home makes a lot of impact. Of course, the teacher's skills as well, but there are some processes that very often are not taken account or sometimes missed. There are a lot of cases, there is a trend, we have a lot of children with dyslexia, not motivated children, and very often teachers, they just think that it's just some pedagogical, maybe not very much given attention. maybe you spoke about this, maybe I missed, maybe I just didn't hear, sorry. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I only got the end of that translation because I was trying to do that. I just have a synopsis of the question.
So sorry. So the question is connected with psychology. So, for example, most teachers, when we are conducting lessons, we don't pay attention, or we don't know about psychological and the physiological aspects of a student. And mostly when students with some dyslexia or just with some other psychological issues, we can say and we can refer such students as, so they don't pay attention or they are demotivated, though we don't pay attention to psychology and some physiology issues. So she asked did you just cover or did you mention in your research such aspects?
Yeah, I'm just having a bit of difficulty hearing. I'm sorry, it might be just my I don't know if my colleagues can, could you hear the question? I'm just having a bit of difficulty with the volume.
1 minute, yeah. Do you hear me? No?
Yes.
Yeah. So, sorry. So the main idea of this question was that most teachers do not pay attention to psychology and the physiology of students. And sometimes when they have some issues based on, for example, such kind of dyslexia or just other psychological some barriers, teachers tend to say that such students that they don't know or they don't pay attention to that. And so she would like to know to what extent did you cover such aspects? So did you pay attention to psychology and physiology of students? So did we just pay attention?
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably the best way to respond to that is that in certainly the National School Improvement Tool, there's underpinning commitment. So in domain 1 of the tool, which is about a shared vision, is actually that this is about learning for all students. It's about inclusivity. It's about all students. And as a theme across all of these domains is around it, there is a domain around differentiation of practice. And that domain really focuses on the kinds of observable, measurable practices that teachers need to do for all students. So we look for evidence to say that it's not good enough to say you've got great practices for this cohort of students. What are you doing? How are you using your resources? How are you building your teachers' capacity to be able to teach all of your students? And how do you know that all of those students are making progress? So those sort of things, while they're not named as psychology or as development, they are named as practices within the tool. So when we're collecting evidence around that, we can see from the way even classrooms are organized how students are included or excluded. We're able to see around the pedagogical practices, and that's one area of the tool that's there. So our research and the tools themselves really connect all those different areas about how a school and how teachers are engaging with all students, regardless of their needs, and differentiating their practice. And we would say that teachers' use of data and their ability to differentiate are critical partners in improvement for all learners.
Perfect, thanks a lot. So now I'll pass the floor to Anthony Tan from UNESCO Kabul, Afghanistan. Anthony, would you like to pose your question orally?
Yes, thank you. Good to see you, Pauline. So my question is more about the perspective of parents or families. Because you talk about teachers using the data, because in some of the societies, as you may know, parents, they focus more about the outcome, more about the progress of the improvement of their children. So I just wondering, based on the experience or examples, how do you see parents or family, they should interpret the data in a more effective way to help their children? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Domain 9 of the National School Improvement Tool actually looks at school community partnerships, and that includes parents. and it describes practices that the schools need to be engaged in to be connecting with their communities and families to be able to drive improvements in learning. One of the things we know is that when teachers are able to describe learning progress by using a learning progression rather than just overall outcomes data, it changes the way in which parents can understand the progress that their students are making. So we know that those practices are really critically important. And we're engaged in some research at the moment in the Northern Territory in Australia. Now, the Northern Territory is a very, it's kind of fairly sparsely populated, and there are many disparate Aboriginal communities that are very remote in these particular areas. And in this research, we are looking at how Domain 9 of the National School Improvement Tool, which is around school community partnerships, can be used to really focus on building community, and that's family capacity, to be able to use and interrogate the data that the school is using to identify areas for improvement. Because in those sorts of situations, there may be quite a cultural gap between what the school values as important and what the community values as important. So the tool is actually being used to frame diving deeper into those characteristics and practices and building the capacity of the community, sometimes to challenge the data that's in school, but certainly to interpret those data in a way that's meaningful for the aspirations of that community. So I don't know if that answers your question, Anthony, but that's part of the research that we're doing. And we know that this is incredibly powerful, because in those contexts, teachers who tend not to be from those communities, who come in and out of the communities, are fairly transient. But it's the community themselves and the families themselves that are staying in the community, the more empowered they are to see how the school is working, how it's teaching, what data are being used, including achievement data, the better the benefit for the students and the community as a whole.
Perfect. That sounds very clear, Pauline. Now I'll give you the floor to a last participant to pose his question. This is Sang Hong from Cambodia.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. This is very good for learning and for the sharing also. Based on my opinion, I would see that in some contexts, the teacher seem not really have enough ability to really build the data and the baseline for his or her classroom with the student. And this seems to be a very large gap. If this is one. And another point is, currently, I do also observe in my context that even the teacher motivation is still a big concern for us as well. So one is we can solve the teacher motivation and teacher shortage in some of the very remote area, and then that can solve a lot. But if we can also provide the capacity to the teacher up to understanding how to build the data and analyze the data, will be very helpful for the school as well. So in this aspect, I would see that the government may need to pay more attention on this and how to adjust the teacher training, especially for the pre-service, and maybe because teacher nowadays they may learn from the previous old pedagogy. So I think a lot of teachers need to really adjust the teaching method and understanding how the data work. So this is, I think, a very big gap, and how the research center can look on that and can make a little bit more recommendation and clarity on the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang Hong. And I think you've touched on an issue that is common again to all the countries that we work in, is how can we ensure that our teachers, whether they are already practicing teachers, but also our teachers in preparation, can have the best possible training in looking at how we might use quality classroom assessments as well as standardized assessments to be able to use those data to really pinpoint starting points for learning. And it's of concern in many countries, well, all the countries that we have worked in, including Australia, that this is something we really need to pay attention to. And this idea, which is has been encapsulated, if you like, in a review in Australia, the Gonski 2 review, is that we really need to focus not on content, we need to really focus on learning. And we really need to know how learning progresses in different areas of learning. And this is a big global conversation. It's, you know, if we're really focusing on learning, then we need to build teachers' skills to be able to understand learning, as we've had from this presentation, measure learning, as we've also had from this presentation, and know the strategies to be able to improve it.
So thank you so much. We are very near the end of our webinar. Before that, and on behalf of NORRAG and the KIX Hub team, I want to thank the Australian Council for Education and Research for partnering with us in organizing our 4th KIX EAP webinar. Dr. Elizabeth, Professor Pauline, Janine, and Dr. Tim, thank you very much for such an informative, clear, and extremely useful presentation on defining, measuring, understanding, and improving learning. A note to our Russian and Arabic language translators who did have excellent work in the background. The current KIX EAP webinar series is one component of the overall KIX initiative that is made possible by the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center from Canada. Our webinars are designed to enhance the utilization of education global public goods for policy and planning. They are all open access, offered in 3 languages, English, Arabic, and Russian, with the recordings publicly available in our websites. Before the end of the year, on 25th of November at 9 a.m. Geneva, the 5th KIX EAP webinar will be jointly organized with UNESCO Bangkok to cover the topic of curriculum implementation, competency-based learning, and the alignment of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessments. After that, already in 2021, our webinars will continue to respond to the thematic priorities identified by the KIX EAP country representatives and contribute to our project's knowledge chain. So please contact your national KIX coordinator and national KIX steering committee to make suggestions for our next webinar series. We want to hear from you, and we take note of the request by Aminat Hadam, professor of the Maldives National University, who contacted us today expressing her interest in organizing a webinar focusing on how different qualitative data could be used to inform teaching. So our journey does not stop today, it's just starting. We also want to learn what and how we can do better. So please fill out the webinar's evaluation survey. The links have been shared in the chat and will be sent to all participants by email. We look forward to continue working with you all in building knowledge and innovation exchange. Thank you and see you all very soon.